The ladder rungs were cold enough to bite through my gloves. I remember that detail more than anything else. From that night, the sharp, metallic cold that traveled up through the wool and pressed into my palms like a warning I didn't know how to read. Indy was behind me, one hand gripping the rail, the other pressed flat against my lower back, like she was afraid I'd disappear into the dark if she let go. Below her, Joel was carrying Cass piggyback, his breathing already ragged from the climb. And Cass, 7 years old, half asleep, had her face buried in his neck like none of this was happening. That image, that specific image, it has lived inside my chest like a splinter for 8 months. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I made the decision, not Indy, not Joel, me. I had the keys, I had the information, and I had the 37 minutes of advantage that the rest of the town didn't have. What I did with that advantage, what I chose to protect, and what I chose to abandon. That is the story I need to tell you. My name is Zane. I was a water utility supervisor for Creston County. I managed pressure systems, valve schedules, filtration cycles. I knew every inch of the infrastructure that kept 80,000 people hydrated and alive. And on the night of September 14th, that knowledge gave me access to something no panicked family scrambling for a highway on-ramp had. A vertical, sealed, structurally reinforced steel tank sitting 42 feet above a floodplain, with an interior maintenance platform, an emergency hatch, and 3 weeks of residual water already inside. The Creston Upper Reserve Tower, Tank 7. I had driven past it every morning for 11 years. The call came at 8:47 p.m. It was Marcus Webb, my deputy supervisor, who worked the night shift and had a habit of never calling unless something was genuinely broken. His voice, when it came through, wasn't broken. It was gone, reduced to this thin, breath-stripped whisper that told me more than any sentence could have. Danny, the treatment plant. Don't come in. Don't come near the south end of town. Just get your family somewhere high, somewhere sealed, right now. I asked him what was happening. He said one word. People. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 because the microwave clock ticked from 8:49:03 to 8:49:14, and I watched every digit change. Then I moved. I woke Indy first, then Joel, my brother, who was staying with us while his apartment was being renovated. Cass was already in bed. I told them to dress in layers. I told them we were leaving. I told them I would explain in the truck. Indy started to ask questions. I handed her a bag and said, "Please." She looked at my face and stopped asking. We drove with the headlights off for the first 6 blocks because something about the ambient light on Creston's west side felt wrong. Too many windows lit, too many cars moving, a kind of frantic brightness that didn't belong to a Thursday night. I heard the first sounds 3 blocks from the tower. Not screaming exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had started as human noise and was in the process of becoming something else entirely. I pressed the accelerator. We reached the access road at 9:14 p.m. I had the gate code memorized. I punched it in, drove through, killed the engine, and looked at my family in the rearview mirror. Joel had Cass in his lap. Indy was gripping the door handle. "There's a maintenance platform inside the tank," I said. 12 feet by 8 feet, dry, sealed, 42 feet up. Indy said, "For how long?" I said, "Until I figure out what's happening." She nodded once. That was Indy, always the measured one, always the one who absorbed the panic and handed back something functional. The first infected person we saw was standing at the base of the access road fence as we started to climb. She was still wearing a hospital bracelet. I didn't let myself look at her for more than 2 seconds. That was the rule I made in real time. Without thinking, 2 seconds of observation, then movement. Anything longer than that and the brain starts processing what the eyes are actually seeing. And processing takes time. And time was the one resource we had already burned through most of. What I saw in those 2 seconds: female, mid-40s, blue patterned hospital gown, bare feet on gravel, head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck muscles had forgotten their basic architecture. She wasn't moving toward us. She was standing at the fence line with both hands pressed flat against the chain link, not gripping, not rattling, just pressing. Like she was trying to feel the vibration of something on the other side. I turned away and told everyone to climb. Joel went first with Cass because height was safety and Cass was the priority. Indy followed. I came last because last meant I could watch the fence, and because some part of me still believed, in those early minutes, that watching would give me control over what I saw. The hatch at the top of Tank 7 was a 22-inch circular steel plate with a compression latch and a rubber gasket seal. I had opened it exactly once before, during a training rotation 2 years prior. My hands remembered the sequence: left grip, quarter turn counterclockwise, lift with both forearms, set aside. The hatch came open with a low, pressurized exhale, and the smell that came out was mineral and dark, water and rust and time. Joel passed Cass through first, then Indy. Then Joel pulled himself up while I held the hatch. I took one final look down the access road before I climbed in. The woman at the fence had been joined by 3 more. They were standing in a loose cluster now, all of them with that same posture, not aggressive, not oriented toward us specifically, just present in a way that felt wrong at a cellular level. Like bodies that had stopped asking permission from the minds that used to run them. I climbed in and sealed the hatch. The interior of Tank 7's maintenance space was a concrete-floored platform that ran along the inner wall of the tank below the waterline's upper threshold. The tank itself was at 20% capacity, enough residual water in the base to be audible, a low, resonant shifting sound every time one of us moved. The platform had a utility cage bolted to the wall, a small electrical panel for the sensor array, and 4 emergency glow strips mounted near the ceiling that activated when I tripped the interior manual switch. We had 3 flashlights from the truck. We had 2 bags I had packed in under 4 minutes, which meant we had 6 protein bars, 2 water bottles, a first aid kit, Joel's phone, my work radio, Indy's medication blood pressure, a 7-day supply, and a change of clothes for Cass that was actually Cass's spare gymnastics outfit, which she found quietly devastating. "I look like I'm going to a meet," she said, looking down at herself. "You look perfect," Joel told her, and meant it. I loved him for that. I love him for that still. Indy sat against the wall with her knees drawn up and watched me inventory. She had this way of watching me work, not monitoring, not anxious, just present and parallel, like she was running her own internal calculations alongside mine and comparing them without comment. After a few minutes, she said, "The radio." "Yeah. Any signal?" I turned the work radio on. The county emergency frequency was active, a recorded message looping on the civil defense channel. It was the standard emergency broadcast format, calm and automated, instructing residents to shelter in place, avoid contact with individuals displaying erratic behavior, and await further instruction from county emergency services. It told us nothing we didn't already know, and it told us everything we needed to understand about how badly this had already outpaced whoever was supposed to be managing it. Joel looked at me across the platform. How long did Marcus say? He didn't. What did he say? I thought about that single word. People. The way he had said it, not as a warning about a crowd, but as a warning about a category. As if the word itself had changed meaning sometime in the last hour, and he didn't have a replacement for it yet. He said to get somewhere high, I said. So we're high. Cass fell asleep around 11 p.m. with her head on Indy's folded jacket. I watched her sleep for a long time. There is something about watching a child sleep in a dangerous place that clarifies everything. Strips away the contingency planning and the radio static and the inventory mathematics and leaves you with one single, unambiguous fact. This is what matters. Everything else is instrumental. Every decision either serves this or it doesn't. Joel was at the hatch, not opening it, just sitting with his back against the sealed steel, listening. He had always been the one in our family who processed through his ears. When we were kids and something went wrong, I would start moving and Joel would go still and quiet and listen until he understood what he was dealing with. It drove me insane as a child. That night, in Tank 7, I was grateful for it. Vehicles, he said quietly. Somewhere south, moving fast. I moved to sit beside him and pressed my ear to the steel. He was right, the distant percussion of engines, multiple, and beneath that, irregular. Not convoy regular, panic regular. The kind of movement that happens when people are driving away from something rather than towards something. How far? Half mile, maybe more. He paused. There's something else. I hear it. Below the engine sounds, beneath even the hum of Tank 7's sensor array, there was a sound that had no easy classification. It was periodic and low and organic, and it seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, which meant either it was being produced by many sources spread across a wide area, or it was an acoustic phenomenon created by whatever was happening in the streets below, bouncing off the tank's curved steel. I chose to believe the second explanation for about 30 minutes before the evidence made that untenable. Indy had been quiet long enough that I checked on her. She was awake, sitting with her head tipped back against the wall, staring at the ceiling of the platform with an expression I recognized. It was the look she got when she was making a decision and hadn't told me yet. Talk, I said. The Hendersons. David and Renata Henderson, our neighbors for 6 years. Their daughter, Priya, was Cass's best friend and had been at a sleepover at our house the previous weekend. They lived 4 blocks from the access road. I know, I said. Did you try to call them? I had. In the 11 seconds, I stood in the kitchen watching the microwave clock. David's phone had rung 5 times and gone to voicemail. Renata's had connected for half a second and then disconnected with a sound that wasn't a hang-up. I tried, I said. Indy nodded slowly. Okay? That okay carried the full weight of what we both understood. That I had prioritized my family over the call. That in those 11 seconds, I had run the calculation and made a choice that excluded 4 people I cared about. That there was no version of this where I was entirely clean. Indy understood this because she would have made the same choice. And she hated it for both of us. Joel said, from the hatch, "Someone's on the access road." I moved. Through the steel I could feel rather than hear a vibration. Footsteps on gravel, irregular cadence, not the same pattern as the woman at the fence. This was someone running, someone with purpose and direction. Then a voice. "Hello, is someone up there?" I saw the truck, please. If someone's up there. I looked at Joel. Joel looked at me. Indy was already on her feet. The voice was a man's, somewhere between 40 and 60. And it had the particular quality of a voice that had already screamed itself raw and was now operating on reserves. What it didn't have was any of the qualities that Marcus had been warning me about. It sounded completely, recognizably human. "Zane," Indy said. "I know. We have to—" "I know, Indy. But knowing and doing are two entirely different physical acts." And I stood with my hand on the compression latch for a full 60 seconds, while the man on the access road called up into the dark. And I ran every calculation I had. And I listened to Cass breathing behind me. Then I opened the hatch. His name was Gerald Fitch. He was 53 years old, wore a County Roads Department jacket over a thermal undershirt, and had a gash across his left forearm that he'd wrapped with a torn strip of his own flannel shirt. He climbed the ladder faster than I expected for a man his size. And when he came through the hatch, he sat down immediately on the platform edge and put his face in his hands for 15 seconds without making a sound. Then he looked up and said, "Thank you." I sealed the hatch behind him. Joel had positioned himself at the back of the platform. With Cass, she had woken up when the hatch opened and was watching Gerald with the calm, analytical attention children sometimes produce when they've decided that being frightened is less useful than being curious. "What happened to your arm?" she asked. "Cass," Indy said. "It's fine," Gerald said. He looked at the arm. "Car door. Trying to get Mrs. Patton's kids out of her station wagon. The door came back on me." "Is Mrs. Patton okay?" Cass asked. None of the adults answered her. Gerald took the protein bar Indy offered and ate half of it before speaking again. He had been at the county roads yard on the south end of town when it started. He described it not as an event, but as a progression, the way a weather system moves in. First, 2 calls on the yard radio about a disturbance near the hospital. Then, his supervisor leaving to investigate and not returning. Then, the sound of the emergency alert system, the mechanical wail of it bouncing off the tin-roofed equipment shed. Then, what he called the people from the hospital parking lot, moving into the surrounding streets in numbers that made individual description impossible. He had driven north. He had seen things he described only in architectural terms, not what the infected were doing, but where they were. How many? Which streets were passable? I understood this as a coping mechanism and did not push for more. "The hospital," I said. "That's where it started?" "That's where it came from," he said, which was a different thing, and he knew it. Indy asked about the police. Gerald said he had seen 2 patrol cars, one stationary in the middle of Clover Street with both doors open and the engine still running, one moving south at high speed and not stopping for anything. Joel asked about the highway. Gerald said the on-ramp at Route 9 had been gridlocked as of 40 minutes ago. And from the elevated vantage of the overpass, he had seen cars abandoned in the median and people moving on foot between them. I thought about the timing. 8:47 p.m. Marcus's call, 9:14 p.m. us at the tower. It was now approaching midnight. That was roughly 2.5 hours of spread in a town of 80,000. "The arm," I said. "The gash. Did anything—" I paused. "Did anyone touch you before the car door?" Gerald looked at me with an expression that was not offended, which told me he had already asked himself the same question. "No," he said. "I was in the yard cab until the roads yard. Nobody came near me." I nodded. I believed him, provisionally, the way you believe anything in the first 12 hours of something like this, with a mental asterisk attached. with a part of your attention permanently allocated to watching for evidence that would revise the assessment. Indy caught my eye, and I knew she understood the same thing. Gerald finished the protein bar and looked around the platform. His gaze moved over the utility cage, the sensor panel, the hatch seal, the glow strips, and inventory, but the slow, exhausted kind. The kind that isn't planning, but just orienting. "How long can you stay up here?" he asked. "As long as we need to," I said. Joel said, "What are we looking at out there? On the streets? What's the actual density?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he didn't use a number. He said, "It's not like they're everywhere. It's more like wherever there was a person, there's still a person. Just not the same kind." Cass had her knees pulled up to her chest and was watching him. "I don't understand," she said. "Neither do I, sweetheart," Gerald told her. That was the most honest thing anyone said all night. Somewhere between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the sounds below changed register. In the first hours, what came up through the tank's steel skin had been recognizable engines, voices, the specific percussion of a city in panic, which has its own distinct acoustic signature once you've heard it. But by the time the county emergency broadcast shifted from recorded message to dead air, the sounds had reorganized themselves into something that felt less like crisis and more like a new kind of ordinary. Lower, more distributed, less frantic. That was the part that frightened me most. Gerald was asleep against the utility cage. Indy had Cass tucked under one arm and was running her fingers slowly through Cass's hair. That automatic parental motion that continues even when the person doing it has stopped being fully present. Joel sat beside me at the hatch. And we talked in the way brothers talk when neither of them wants to say the thing that's actually on their mind, sideways, through adjacent subjects, building toward the real conversation by inches. "The radio's been quiet for 40 minutes, he said. "I know. County emergency or someone else would be broadcasting if there was coordination happening." "Probably. Which means either the broadcast equipment went down or the people running it did." I didn't respond to that. Not because I disagreed. He picked at a seam in his jacket sleeve for a moment. "How much water is actually in this tank?" "At 20% capacity, maybe 180,000 gallons. Most of it's below us, in the bowl." "Drinkable?" "Filtered and chlorinated as of 48 hours ago, yeah. So water's not the constraint. Food is the constraint. And Indy's medication." He looked at the bag. 7 days of pills. "Yeah." "And after that?" "Her blood pressure's managed. If she reduces sodium intake, stays off her feet as much as possible, 7 days without medication becomes maybe 10 or 12 days before there's any real risk." Joel nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was filing information rather than responding to it. Then he said, "We need to know what's actually out there before we make any decision about coming down." "Agreed. Which means visibility. In daylight. Which means we wait for dawn." It was the most basic and obvious plan available to us, and we both knew it. And saying it out loud was not about information, it was about discipline, about forcing the brain to commit to a defined timeline rather than letting it run open-ended catastrophizing loops through the remaining dark hours. Gerald stirred against the cage. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, then at us, with the rapid reorientation of someone who had fallen asleep somewhere alarming and briefly forgotten where they were. "Still up there," he said. "Still up there," I confirmed. He grunted and repositioned himself, and then, after a moment, said without looking at us, "My wife is in Medford. staying with her sister. She doesn't know I'm—" He stopped, recalibrated. "She's not here, that's all." "Then she's probably okay," Joel said. Gerald said nothing to that, but the tension in his shoulders changed, not released, but rearranged into something more bearable, which is sometimes the only structural modification grief will permit. I had been thinking about Marcus Webb since the moment we sealed the hatch. His voice on that call, the whispering, the single word. I tried to construct a timeline that had Marcus in it, somewhere, doing something survivable. The treatment plant was on the south end of town, which, based on Gerald's account, put it very close to the origin point of whatever had come out of the hospital. The plant had a security office, a break room, multiple sealed interior sections. I could build a version of events where Marcus had locked himself in somewhere and was waiting, the same as us. I could build it. I just couldn't make it stable. The thing about knowing someone well enough is that you also know their reflexes. Marcus Webb's first reflex in any emergency was to move toward the problem, not away from it. He had been a volunteer firefighter for 11 years before the utility job. He didn't seal himself in rooms. He would have gone back into that plant. And whatever was at the south end of town at 8:47 p.m. on September 14th would have met him there. I stopped building the timeline. Dawn came gray and indifferent, the way it does after bad nights. I had the hatch open by 6:12 a.m., just the seal broken, not the plate lifted, enough to let air move through the gap and carry sound up from below. Joel was beside me. Indy and Gerald and Cass were awake. Cass was eating half a protein bar with the methodical patience of someone who understood, without being told, that eating slowly made it last. I lifted the hatch. The air that came in was cool and smelled of September morning damp concrete, cut grass from somewhere distant, and underneath those normal smells, something else. Not rotting exactly, not chemical. Something metabolic and low and wrong. The way a hospital corridor smells different from the rooms adjacent to it. Like proximity to a changed state, leaves a residue in the air. Joel went to the edge of the platform and looked down through the hatch opening. The access road was visible from the top of the ladder, a gray gravel strip curving through a stand of mature oaks before connecting to the service gate. He stayed there for nearly a minute without speaking. 6, he said finally. Minimum, maybe 9, hard to tell from here. Spread across the access road and the tree line. Moving? Slowly, inconsistently. He paused. The truck is still there. I processed that. The truck being still there meant no one had taken it, which meant either nobody had come to the access road in sufficient functional state to recognize a vehicle as useful, or the infected weren't interacting with vehicles, which told me something about what they were now operating on. Toward the gate or away from it? I asked. Neither, just ambient, like they've settled into the area. Gerald had come to stand behind us. He looked down over Joel's shoulder and then looked back at me. That's what it was like at the Rhodes yard, he said quietly. By the time I left, they weren't chasing anyone. They were just occupying space, like they didn't have a specific destination anymore. The implication of that was significant, and I turned it over carefully. If the infected were no longer pursuit-oriented, if they had transitioned from acute aggression to something more like territorial distribution, then movement through their presence became a question of stealth and patience rather than speed. That changed the calculus for any potential exit. It also changed nothing about the immediate situation, which was that we were 42 feet above 9 of them, with one ladder, one exit, and a 7-year-old. Indy appeared at my shoulder, She had put Cass at the back of the platform with strict instructions to stay there. She looked down, looked at the distribution of figures on the access road, and then looked at me with the second version of the expression from the night before. Not the deciding look, but the already decided look. "We need more information before we go anywhere," she said. "Agreed. Which means we need to see the broader area." She looked at the tank's exterior. "This thing has an observation rim, doesn't it? A maintenance walkway at the top." It did. A 12-inch wide painted steel catwalk that circled the exterior top of the tank, accessible by a secondary hatch above the main platform. I had walked it exactly once during the training rotation, and I had not liked the experience. The catwalk had no interior rail on the tank side, only the outer safety railing, and the wind at that height made structural confidence a conscious project. "I'll go," I said. "I'll go with you," Joel said. "One of us should stay with Indy and Cass and Gerald." Joel looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him with the expression of a man who has accepted that his role in this specific situation is defined by recent arrival and injury. "I'll be here," Gerald said. We went through the secondary hatch. The morning air hit differently at the top of the tank. It moved in long, cold sweeps from the northwest, carrying with it the sound of the town below, not the frantic sounds of last night, but the new sounds of whatever the town was becoming. I gripped the outer railing and made myself look. What I saw took the breath out of me completely. Creston, from 42 feet up, looked almost peaceful. That was the first deception of it, the familiar grid of residential streets. The church steeple catching early light, the gas station sign on Route 9, still cycling its price display through 3 grades of fuel. That no one would ever buy at those prices again. From height, the ordinary structure of a place persists long after its function has been destroyed. The streets were still streets, the houses were still houses, the cars in the driveways were still cars. But they were also occupied in the wrong way. I counted without meaning to. A professional habit. The kind that activates involuntarily when the brain needs to replace panic with data. In the 12-block radius I could directly observe from the catwalk, I counted what I estimated to be 60 to 80 figures, scattered across intersections, yards, the parking lot of the Methodist church, the walking path along Creston Creek. None of them were moving with purpose. Most were stationary. A few drifted in slow, non-directional arcs, like buoys in mild water. Joel stood beside me and did his own version of the same calculation. "The density isn't uniform," he said. "Look at the northeast quadrant." He was right. The area north of Creston Creek, a newer residential development that had been built around a retention pond and a community park, showed significantly fewer figures than the older downtown core. Whether that was because the outbreak had moved from south to north and hadn't fully saturated the northern neighborhood yet, or because the demographics of the area had produced different exposure patterns, I couldn't determine from this distance. What I could determine, Route 9 was impassable. The gridlock Gerald had described was visually confirmed from here. A line of stationary vehicles stretching from the overpass to the edge of my sight line, with at least a dozen figures moving among the cars. Not the cars themselves, but between them, through them, in the spaces where doors had been left open. The County Roads Department yard was visible to the south. It was approximately 1.1 miles from the tower. I didn't look at it for very long. "Danny," Joel said, "I see it." He hadn't been pointing at the road's yard. He was pointing northeast toward the newer residential area, where a particular house, a pale blue colonial on Whitmore Drive, had a second-floor window with something in it. Not movement, something deliberate. A light source, timed. Flash, pause, flash, flash, pause, flash, a pattern. "That's Morse," Joel said. He watched for another 30 seconds. "Partial, anyway. SOS, then something else I can't parse. Someone's alive over there." "Yeah." He gripped the railing. "Someone's signaling." We watched for another 2 full minutes. The signal repeated 4 times, consistent and deliberate, which meant whoever was producing it had both the capacity and the intention to keep doing it. "How far?" Joel asked. "Whitmore Drive." I ran the geography. "Through the park, across the creek bridge, 3 blocks northeast. Call it 3/4 of a mile." "With that density on the streets." "Yeah." We both stood with that for a moment. 3/4 of a mile, under different circumstances, is a 12-minute walk. Under these circumstances, it was an entirely different kind of distance, not measured in feet, but in decisions, each one of them with an attached cost. "We can't get there right now," I said. "Not with Cass." "No," Joel agreed. He wasn't agreeing that we shouldn't try. He was agreeing that the current conditions made it impossible with a 7-year-old in the group, which was a more specific and more honest statement. We watched the signal until it stopped. Then we watched the space where it had been. "When we go down," Joel said finally, "do we go toward that, or do we go for Route 9? Route 9 is gone. You saw it. There are other routes out of the county. Through the eastern township roads, yes, which adds distance and takes us through lower density areas. Or," Joel said, "we find out who's in that window." He was positing it as an option, not an argument. Joel had always known that the way to move me toward a position was not to advocate for it, but to locate it on the map and let me find my own way there. I looked at the pale blue colonial one more time. Then we went back down. The decision to stay another full day was unanimous, which made it feel like the wrong kind of unanimous. Not the unanimous of agreement, the unanimous of nobody wanting to be the one who moved. Gerald was healing. Cass needed rest. The figures on the access road had not dispersed by mid-morning. And the signal from Whitmore Drive had stopped by 9 a.m. and not resumed, which introduced the possibility that whoever had been sending it no longer could. And I did not want to name that possibility out loud. We rationed. 2 protein bars split 5 ways, morning and evening. Water from the tank via the maintenance utility tap, clean, chlorinated, sufficient. Cass and Gerald slept during the midday heat. Indy organized the first aid kit with the methodical quiet of someone managing anxiety through productive motion. I spent most of the day thinking about Gerald's arm. The wound itself appeared clean, no redness spreading from the edges, no heat when I pressed 2 fingers alongside it that afternoon. He had taken the antiseptic wrap we had in the kit and kept it dry. His temperature, when Indy pressed a palm to his forehead in the way you do when you don't have a thermometer, was normal. But I was thinking about it anyway. Because the question of transmission, how it moved, under what conditions, through what contact, was a variable we had no data on. Gerald said no one had touched him. I believed him. And I also knew that belief was doing work that evidence was supposed to do, and that I was letting it because the alternative was a set of actions I was not ready to take in a 12 by 8 foot space with my 7-year-old daughter 4 feet away. Joel noticed me watching Gerald. He came and sat beside me and said quietly, "He's fine." "Probably." "What's your threshold?" "I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what the actual transmission mechanism is. Without that, I can't set a rational threshold." Then we watch and we wait. Yeah. Joel pulled at a loose rubber seal on the utility cage. "I've been thinking about the signal." "Me too. If it started around dawn and ended by 9 a.m., either they ran out of energy, or they were interrupted, or they saw us on the catwalk and knew the message was received." I hadn't considered that. From the window of the Colonial on Whitmore Drive, a person with the right sight line could have observed 2 figures on the exterior catwalk of Tank 7. If they knew what Tank 7 was, and anyone who lived in Northeast Creston and had driven past it daily would have a basic visual familiarity, they would know that the catwalk was occupied and that their signal had been witnessed. Stopping the signal in that reading was a form of confirmation. "How many people do you think are still functionally alive in Creston?" Joel asked. "Thousands, probably. Most people have doors and locks and instincts. But without food, without coordination..." "I know." He stopped pulling at the seal. "Cass asked me this morning what happened to Priya." The name landed like a dropped tool, sudden and specific, and impossible to muffle. Priya Henderson, 8 years old, who had been at our house the previous weekend, who had eaten 3 of Cass's strawberry fruit snacks and taught Cass a clapping game she'd learned at school. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that Priya and her family were probably somewhere safe, just like us." "Good." She said, "Do you actually know that, or are you just saying it?" He paused. "She's 7, Danny." "I know. She's smarter than we're giving her credit for. She always has been." I looked at Cass across the platform, asleep now, mouth slightly open, one hand curled beneath her chin. Which is part of what scares me. Because smart meant she was building an accurate picture from the available data, the same as we were. And the picture we were all building, in those hours in the tank, had edges that didn't resolve cleanly. It had a woman in a hospital gown at a fence line. It had Marcus Webb's voicemail. It had the roads of Creston, occupied by people who were still people in form, but something else in function. Smart meant Cass was assembling that picture. And eventually, she was going to show it to us. The signal resumed at 4:47 p.m. I was on the catwalk when it started. I'd gone up for a second assessment of street-level movement in the late afternoon, hoping that the figures I'd observed that morning might have redistributed or thinned. They hadn't in any meaningful way, but their movement patterns had shifted slightly with the change in light, becoming more directional as the shadows lengthened, which gave me information I hadn't had before. They responded to light gradient. That was important. The pale blue Colonial's second-floor window caught the low sun at the western exposure, which made the flash signal harder to read than it had been in the flat morning light. But it was there. Consistent, deliberate, now extended beyond SOS into something more structured. I watched for 4 minutes before I recognized the pattern as a truncated alphabetic sequence. Simple substitutions, 1 flash for A, 2 for B, and so on. Slow, patient, intended to be read by someone who was watching and who had time to decode. The message, as I assembled it in my head over approximately 11 minutes of watching. Tower, how many food? Eastgate. I held on to the outer railing and read it 3 more times. They knew we were in the tower. They knew it had an east gate, the secondary access, a pedestrian latch at the far end of the access road, behind a stand of oaks that would provide significant concealment from the main road. And they were asking about food in the same breath as they were asking about headcount, which meant they were in the same calculation we were, running the same survival arithmetic. I went down and told the others. Gerald straightened immediately. Someone's organized over there. Someone's communicating, at least. That's not the same thing. No. But the signal being structured using a system, transmitting specific information requests, that takes presence of mind. Someone over there is functional. Indy looked at the bag. East Gate. It's on the other side of the access road from where most of the figures were this morning, I said. Behind the oaks. If the movement pattern we saw this afternoon holds, if they track toward light and open space, the tree line might provide enough concealment. Might, Joel said. Yes, might. Cass was watching the adult conversation with the antenna deployment patience she used when she knew the adults were talking about something important and had not yet decided to exclude her from it. Are we going somewhere? She asked. We're thinking about it, I said. To the Blue House. I looked at her. How do you know about the Blue House? I looked through the hatch when you weren't watching. She said this without apology, which was accurate to her character. There's a person in the window. I saw the flashing. Cass, I'm not a baby, Dad. The word dad used in that particular register, the one that meant she was claiming the relationship as a tool rather than as comfort, hit me somewhere between my sternum and my spine. I know you're not, I said. So is the person in the Blue House okay? We don't know yet. But they're sending messages, so they know how to ask for help. She considered this. That's more than a lot of people can do right now. I did not know how to respond to that. Joel made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one not at Cass's expense, but at the unarguable precision of it. Gerald said, She's right. Indy was looking at me with the fourth distinct expression in 24 hours. Not the measuring look, not the deciding look, not the already decided look. This was the watching look. The one that meant she was monitoring not the situation, but me checking what the situation was doing to me at an interior level that the others couldn't see. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I turned back to the secondary hatch. I'm going back up. I'm going to signal back. 1 flash for yes, 2 for no. Signal what? Joel asked. That there are 5 of us, that we have water, and that we'll come to the East Gate at 0600 tomorrow morning. I paused. If they can give us something worth coming for. They signaled back within 3 minutes. The response was longer than I expected, a full 2-minute transmission that I decoded, standing on the catwalk as the sun dropped behind the western tree line and the town below organized itself into a specific kind of dusk quiet that I was already learning to read as a pattern. The figures moved differently in the transition light. They coalesced slightly, drawn toward the residual warmth of south-facing walls and surfaces that had stored the day's heat. The message from the blue colonial said, 4 people, doctor, medications need insulin, East Gate, safe oak, cover, stay low, we watch. A doctor. I came down the hatch and repeated the transmission to the group. Indy's expression shifted in a way I hadn't seen since the beginning of this, not the controlled, measured responses she had been producing to manage the situation, but something that broke briefly through that management. Because a doctor wasn't just a person. A doctor, in this specific context, on day 2 of whatever this was, with Indy's medication at 6 days remaining, was a recalibration of the entire survival structure we were operating within. Insulin, Gerald said. They have a diabetic in the group. Or the doctor is diabetic, Joel said, or someone else. Either way, they're in the same constraint we are. Medication supply. He paused. Which means they're also going to run out. Unless they can access a pharmacy. Or the hospital. Nobody said anything for a moment after that. The hospital sat in the south of town, at the origin point of everything that had happened. Discussing it as a resource was not a conversation any of us were ready to have on day 2. The decision to move at dawn was confirmed. We divided the logistics. Indy would carry Cass if needed, though Cass had already announced she would walk on her own. Joel would take the front, reading the path. I would take the rear. Gerald, despite his arm, offered the middle position and was not argued with. We would take both bags. We would move in silence. We would use the oak tree stand on the east side of the access road for cover. Gerald asked about the figures currently on the road. Down to 3 visible from the hatch observation, I said. They've moved south with the light transition. If the pattern holds, at dawn they'll be oriented toward the east and south. If the pattern holds, Joel repeated. Yeah. Cass spent the evening doing a thing I will never forget. She took the gymnastics outfit she was wearing, the one she had mourned the previous night, and she rolled the sleeves twice, tightened the waistband into a knot at her hip, and announced that it was now a survivor outfit, and she had decided to keep it. She was 7 years old, and she had just done something that most adults spend days failing to accomplish. She had reclassified loss as adaptation. Joel watched her do it and then looked at the wall for a while. Indy took her blood pressure medication at 8 p.m., 6 remaining. Gerald's arm, in the glow strip light, showed no signs of deterioration. His temperature was stable. His thinking was clear, and his responses were appropriate. I had been watching him at every opportunity for 36 hours. I adjusted my mental asterisk. Not removed, adjusted. We slept in rotation. Joel and I alternated 2-hour watches at the hatch, monitoring the access road. Around 3 a.m., one of the remaining figures below drifted off the gravel and into the brush at the road's edge and did not return to visibility. By 5 a.m., 2 figures remained both stationary, both in the middle of the access road, both facing east. I woke everyone at 5:30 a.m. Cass ate the last third of her protein bar. She put on her shoes with the concentration of someone preparing for something significant. She tied them twice, which she had learned to do after a sneaker had come untied during a school cross-country race and she had fallen. She had learned from the failure. She had tied them twice ever since. I looked at her doing it, and I felt the love and the terror of it in equal and inseparable measure. Then I opened the hatch and we started down. The access road gravel was louder than I remembered. Every footstep produced a sound that felt egregious, a dry, spreading crunch that seemed to broadcast our position to the entire county. I had gone down first, paused at the base of the ladder, scanned the visible length of the road. The 2 figures were still where I had last observed them from above, approximately 60 meters northeast, standing with their backs to us in the early light, oriented toward whatever had captured their attention in the eastern distance. I waved the group down, Joel with Cass, Indy, Gerald last. We crossed to the oak stand in a compact line, moving in heel-to-toe steps on the gravel's edge where it met the soil, and the noise compressed slightly. Cass moved with a controlled stillness that I had not coached her on. She had simply observed the adults and adopted the posture. Joel had his hand on her shoulder, not guiding so much as maintaining contact. The east gate was a pedestrian latch at the far end of the fence line. A lever handle, no code, intended for maintenance staff who needed access without vehicles. I reached it, lifted the latch with slow pressure, and pushed it open into the brush on the other side. One of the figures on the road turned, not toward us, 90 degrees from us, in the direction of a sound that I never identified, something in the distance, a bird or a falling branch or a shift in the ambient noise architecture of the morning. The figure turned toward that sound and stood with its characteristic stillness. And we moved through the gate, and I closed it behind us. The brush on the far side of the fence was dense enough to provide cover for the first 40 meters. We moved through it in a crouch, staying below the sight line of the road, until the oak stand thickened into a proper tree line that had us concealed on 3 sides. Joel stopped and held up a fist. We froze. 20 meters ahead, at the edge of the tree line where it met the path leading toward Creston Creek, a single figure stood with its back against an oak trunk. Not one of the infected, I could tell immediately from the posture, which was the held, deliberate stillness of a person choosing not to move, rather than the ambient, unanchored stillness of one of them. A woman. Mid-30s. Dark jacket, close-cropped hair. She had a length of copper pipe in one hand, held low against her thigh. She looked at us with a rapid, comprehensive assessment that I recognized as professional, not just survival sharp, but trained. She checked our count, our movement quality, our faces, and then she lowered the pipe. She said, very quietly, 5, good. I counted 5 from the window. She nodded. I'm Yolanda Park. I was the night rotation physician at Creston Memorial. I left at 7:45 p.m. on the 14th, and I have not been back. She looked at Cass briefly. Good to see kids still coming through. Cass said, Are you the doctor from the Blue House? I am. Do you know what's happening to people? Yolanda looked at her with an expression that was careful and respectful and honest, simultaneously a clinical expression. The one that meant the answer was going to be real rather than soft. I know some of it, she said. I'll tell you everything I know. But we should move first. She took us along the creek path, a route she had clearly pre-walked and assessed, because she moved through it with the precision of rehearsal, pausing at each exposed crossing, checking sight lines before waving us through. She brought us across the bridge in 2 groups, Yolanda and Cass and Joel first, then Gerald, Indy, and me. We were at the Colonial on Whitmore Drive by 6:38 a.m. Inside, in the dim light of a house with all the ground floor windows covered in blackout fabric, we met the other 3. An older couple, Arthur and Bev Strain, both in their 70s, who had the particular composed dignity of people who have survived enough decades to recognize catastrophe without being destroyed by it. And a teenage boy named Dom, Yolanda's nephew, who was 16 and sitting at the kitchen table with a pad of paper, still transcribing the Morse signals he had been managing. He looked up when we came in and said, I told her someone was in the tower. Yolanda said, You were right. Yolanda told us what she knew in the kitchen of the Colonial on Whitmore Drive. While Bev Strain made tea on a gas burner, and Arthur sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and the expression of a man who had decided to receive whatever information was coming with complete equanimity. What Yolanda knew was bounded, honest, and terrifying in its specific quality. She had been at the hospital on the night of the 14th. The first patients had arrived by ambulance from a residential care facility on the south edge of Creston, a memory care unit. 7 residents, accompanied by 3 staff members. The presenting symptoms had not initially been alarming. Agitation, confusion, elevated temperature. These were not unusual for dementia patients in distress. The triage nurse had flagged one patient for elevated aggression and placed him in a side bay with restraints. At 7:19 p.m., the patient in the side bay had sustained injuries to his restraints and had bitten a charge nurse. The charge nurse had been removed to a treatment room. By 7:35 p.m., the charge nurse had begun exhibiting identical symptoms. Yolanda had been in a consultation with the attending physician when the call came from the EER. She had gone down. She had seen enough in 40 seconds to know that the protocol she was trained for was insufficient, and that the speed of the presentation was outside any pathological framework she had been educated in. She had left the hospital at 7:45 p.m. She had taken two things, her medical bag, and Dom, who had been waiting in the hospital lobby to drive her home. "The insulin," I said. The signal mentioned insulin. "Arthur," she said. The older man nodded once, matter-of-factly. "Type 1. Managed for 52 years. I had approximately 4 weeks of supply when this started." He looked at Yolanda. "She's been moderating my dosage. We have perhaps 9 days remaining at the current adjusted rate." "There are 2 pharmacies in Northeast Creston," Yolanda said. "I've mapped them. One is 3 blocks from here, but it requires crossing the main boulevard, which has significant exposure. The second is 6 blocks east, accessible through the residential grid, significantly lower exposure." "We passed the residential grid on the way here," Joel said. "It's navigable. Dom and I have been to within a block of it. We've assessed the sight lines." She paused. "We didn't go the final block because I didn't want to do it with 2 people." The implication was clear, and no one needed to articulate it. Gerald said, "When?" "As soon as we have a plan." Yolanda looked at him. "Your arm." "Car door," he said. She looked at him with the clinical assessment expression and held it for a moment longer than social protocol would normally allow. "May I examine it?" He extended his arm without hesitation. She unwrapped the bandage, inspected the wound for 90 seconds with a small penlight from her bag, pressed along the wound margins, checked the distal circulation. Then she rewrapped it. "Clean," she said. "You'll want proper closure, but the tissue's healthy. No signs of systemic involvement." She said it without emphasis, but the relief that moved through the room was structural. It changed the quality of the air in the kitchen, the angle of people's posture. Dom had been writing on his notepad throughout all of this. He slid it across the table to Yolanda. It was a route map to the Eastern Pharmacy, hand-drawn, annotated with his own observations from the prior 2 days of watching from the second-floor window. He said, "I've been tracking their movement patterns." He was 16, and he said this with the contained, apologetic precision of someone who had more information than the adults and wasn't sure if that was okay. "I made a grid, if you want to see it." I looked at the grid. It was meticulous, a block-by-block notation of figure presence, movement direction, and time of observation, cross-referenced with light conditions. It was, in its raw form, a behavioral data set. "This is exceptional," I said. Dom looked at the table. "I had time." Joel picked up the notepad and studied it. He looked up at me. He looked at the route to the pharmacy. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Same window, same light conditions." That was when Indy's chair scraped back. Indy said, "I want to go." The kitchen went quiet in the particular way of a room where everyone is doing their own rapid internal calculations simultaneously, and each person is arriving at the same result, but waiting to see if someone else will say it first. I said, "Indy, don't." The word was gentle, not a fight a boundary, which is a different thing. She looked at me across the table. "I know what you're about to say, and I know why you're going to say it. And I'm telling you, as clearly as I can say it, that I want to go." Yolanda was watching this exchange with a physician's attention, the kind that is not about the words, but about the person producing them. "Your medication," I said, "is the reason I should go. 5 days remaining as of this morning. Yolanda will know where to look in the pharmacy. I know my own prescription, the exact formulation, the dosage range. Having me there reduces the search time. She was correct, and she knew that I knew she was correct, and she also knew that correct was not the primary thing at issue. The primary thing at issue was that she was my wife, and I'd been making decisions based on keeping her inside the radius of things I could see and control. And that this instinct, while comprehensible, was not a survival strategy. It was an anxiety response with the word protection applied to the outside of it. Joel said, "She's right, Danny." Gerald said nothing, which was its own form of agreement. I looked at Indy. She looked back. 21 years of marriage meant that the conversation we were having was visible to both of us and invisible to everyone else in the room, which was appropriate. "You stay with the group," I said. "You move when Yolanda moves. You stop when Yolanda stops." "Yes. And if something changes, then we adapt, the same as we've been doing." I nodded. Cass had been at the far end of the kitchen, sitting with Bev Strain, who had been quietly and deliberately occupying Cass's attention with a deck of cards and what appeared to be an explanation of gin rummy. But children have peripheral processing that adults have been trained out of, and Cass had heard all of it. She looked up from the cards. She looked at Indy. Then she looked at me. She didn't say anything. She went back to the cards. That restraint, that specific elected silence, was harder to carry than any question she had asked. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Yolanda briefed the route in detail using Dom's grid as a foundation. Adding her own medical-specific annotations, she knew the pharmacy layout, knew where the controlled medication storage was located, knew the likely position of what she needed. Dom walked us through the movement pattern data. The figures were most concentrated on the main boulevard between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., likely due to the southern exposure of the boulevard's orientation. The residential grid showed its lowest density in the early morning, 0600 to 0800, in the low-angle light. Same window as our crossing that morning, the team for the pharmacy run. Yolanda, Joel, Indy, and Gerald. The team for the house. Me, Cass, Arthur, Bev, and Dom. I told Joel privately, before dinner, that if anything changed on the route, any variable that didn't match Dom's grid, he was to abort. No medication was worth an uncontrolled exposure in unfamiliar territory. Joel said, "I know." "Say it back." He looked at me. "If it doesn't match, we abort. We come back. We figure out a different approach." "Yeah." He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment. Brothers communicate in compression. Everything that needs to be said gets said in the quality of a gesture rather than its content. What Joel's hand on my shoulder said was, "I will bring her back. And also, I know this is hard. And also, you made the right call letting her go." I went to sleep on a folded blanket on the Colonial's living room floor. Cass was between me and the couch where Indy had settled. I could hear Indy's breathing in the dark. I counted it. Regular, low, steady. I counted her breaths until I lost count. That is the last thing I remember before morning. I woke at 5:17 a.m. to the sound of the front door closing. Not slamming closing, with the quiet, intentional care of someone who has made a decision and is managing its logistics with precision. I was upright before I was fully conscious, and I crossed the dark living room in 4 steps and opened the door into a gray pre-dawn that smelled of fog off the creek. The front walk was empty. I looked left, right. The residential street of Whitmore Drive showed no figures in my immediate sight line, which Dom's grid had predicted but which still required a moment to trust. Then I looked toward the creek path. 4 figures moving in the low light. Compact, quiet, measured. the posture of people who had rehearsed the route in their heads all night. Yolanda at the front, Joel behind her, Gerald, Indy at the rear. They had left 30 minutes early. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Every instinct I had wanted to call out. Every calculation I could make told me that calling out would be a catastrophic error. I watched them until the creek path bent and took them from my sight line. Then I went back inside and stood in the kitchen and understood, at a molecular level, the specific texture of helplessness that parents of grown children must feel the moment when your function shifts from active protection to simply bearing witness. And you realize that bearing witness is not a lesser act, but a different one, and that the difference is permanent. Dom was awake. He was at the window with his notepad. "They left early," he said, without looking away from the street. "Yeah. The early window is actually better. Lower light saturation on the east side." He made a notation. "I should have said that last night. It's okay. She'll be all right." He said it without qualifying it, without the tentative inflection of uncertain comfort. He said it as if he had looked at the data and reached a conclusion. I appreciated that more than he could have known. Cass woke at 6 a.m. I told her that Mama and Joel and the others had gone to get medicine and would be back. She looked at me with the calibrated attention she had been deploying throughout this entire sequence of events, checking my face for the information my words weren't carrying. Whatever she found there, she accepted. She said, "Can I have water?" "Yes." "And then can I learn gin rummy?" "Absolutely." Arthur was already at the kitchen table when we came in, his insulin administered for the morning, his hands folded in the same composed posture as yesterday. He looked at Cass and produced a small, specific smile, the kind that old people sometimes offer children in difficult circumstances, which carries within it the full weight of everything the old person has survived and the implicit assurance that survival is in fact possible. "I'll teach you myself," Arthur said. "Bev taught me wrong for 20 years on purpose so she could win." From the back room, Bev said, "I taught you correctly, and you simply lack aptitude." Cass sat down across from Arthur, and they began. I went back to the window with Dom. We tracked the morning. He maintained his grid. I watched the residential streets, the creek path, the distant rooftops of northeast Creston, settling into a second morning of whatever this was. The fog from the creek dissipated by 7 a.m. The light sharpened. The ambient presence of figures in the street grid was low and consistent with Dom's projections. At 7:43 a.m., Dom said, "Movement on the creek path." I moved to the window. 4 figures coming back up the creek path, the same compact measured posture, the same sequence: Yolanda, Joel, Gerald, Indy. All 4. Indy had a canvas pharmacy bag on her shoulder. Even from this distance I could see that it was heavy. I went to the door. I watched the path. I made myself stay at the door and not run across the yard, because running across the yard would have been driven by something that was about me and not about them. When they reached the front walk, Indy looked up at me. She held up the bag. Then she walked up to the door and past me into the house, and I heard her say from the kitchen doorway, in the voice she reserved for Cass when she was most completely and specifically herself, "I'm back, baby. Mama's back." And Cass, without looking up from her cards, said, "I know. I've been winning." We stayed in the Colonial on Whitmore Drive for 19 days. By the end of the first week, there were 14 of us. People came in ones and twos, a retired firefighter from the next street over, a woman who had been sheltering in her car in the creek park, a father and his teenage daughter who had walked 6 miles from the southern grid following Dom's signal pattern, which he had resumed broadcasting from the window each morning at dawn. Yolanda managed the medical inventory with a precision that bordered on the sacred. Arthur's insulin extended to 26 days through Yolanda's dosage management and a second pharmacy run that we executed in a group of 6 with better preparation and cleaner execution. Indy's blood pressure medication was secured on day 12 from a community health clinic 2 neighborhoods north, where we also found antibiotics and a working hand crank emergency radio. By day 19, the radio carried the first organized broadcast from the National Guard's forward coordination point at Hargrove Airfield, 20 miles north. We left the following morning. Gerald was the one who drove. He turned out to be the calmest driver in the group, which nobody had predicted. Cass still has the gymnastics outfit. She won't give it up. She calls it her survivor's suit. And I have stopped trying to talk her out of it, because she is right that it is exactly that. And because some things that get renamed in the middle of a catastrophe deserve to keep their new names. She earned hers. We all did.